Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at food production and, where our food comes from and all the interesting hidden things that go on.
Yeah, we often think of, fields and farms when we think of food, but there's actually, kind of this hidden world of microbes that are playing a really crucial role in what ends up on our plates.
Yeah, it's really incredible. And, this isn't just about like knowing cool facts and trivia. This is really about helping you as listeners make informed choices as consumers. So let's dive right in. Have you ever thought about the fact that you're actually eating microbes every day?
Yeah, even if you don't realize it, you are, take for example, spirulina, that green powder that you often see in smoothies. Yeah, you're actually consuming cyanobacteria, which is this microbe that's packed full of nutrients, and it's been a food source for centuries.
So that's an example of like eating microbes in their natural form. But we also have something called single cell protein or SCP. And this is when we're talking about dried bacteria or yeast as food.
It's exactly. And SCP is often produced on a large scale using byproducts from other industries. And so that makes it a really sustainable protein source. Some early examples of this include protein, which was used for animal feed. And then there's mycoprotein, which you might know as corn, which is a meat alternative made from fungus.
That's pretty wild. So we've got these microbes that are these tiny little protein factories. Concept of single cell protein or SCP.
Right.
You mentioned that this is like a potential protein powerhouse of the future.
Oh, yeah. SCP. It's all about harnessing the power of microbes like bacteria and yeast, drying them out and using them as a protein source. And one of the things that's really cool about this is that it can often be produced using waste materials from other industries. So it's incredibly efficient and sustainable.
Yeah, and we touched on protein, which was used for animal feed. But what about for humans? Could we one day see SCP burgers or sausages on supermarket shelves?
It's definitely a possibility. There are companies out there who are exploring SCP for use in human food products. I think the challenge is really about creating those textures and flavors that people are going to find appealing, and then also kind of overcoming the hurdle of consumer perception.
Yeah, I think you're right. Some people might be a little hesitant to eat bacteria, even if it is good for them and good for the planet.
Yeah, I think that's understandable. Food choices are deeply personal, and they're really influenced by our culture.
Mm.
But, as the world is facing this need for more sustainable food solutions, SCP could become a really important player in that, especially if we can integrate it into familiar foods in a way that people are comfortable with.
It's amazing to think about how food technology is always evolving and how factors like sustainability and nutritional needs and even consumer demand are driving those changes. So, speaking of advancements, what other innovations in food biotechnology have caught your eye?
One area that I think is particularly exciting is precision fermentation. So this is like programming microbes to become these tiny little food factories that create specific molecules that we want.
Hmm.
So maybe it's something to enhance flavor or to improve texture or to even boost nutritional value.
Mm.
So for example, imagine yeast that has been engineered to make a protein that makes plant-based burgers taste and feel just like a regular beef burger.
Wow, that's incredible. So, we're basically harnessing the power of nature on a microscopic level to create foods that are both delicious and good for the environment.
Exactly. And precision fermentation really has the potential to revolutionize the food industry. It could create entirely new ingredients. It could enhance the ones that we already have. And it could even reduce our reliance on traditional agricultural practices.
So, we're looking at a future where maybe food production isn't limited to just farms and fields, but labs and bioreactors are playing an increasingly important role.
That's right. It's like a fascinating convergence of biology, technology, and even the culinary arts. And this convergence gives us the potential to address some of the big challenges that our food systems are facing today. So things like sustainability, food security, and even meeting the needs of diverse diets.
Yeah, it's really mind-blowing to think about all the possibilities. But of course, whenever we're talking about new technology, we have to think about the ethics too. So what sorts of questions should we be asking as we move forward in this area of food biotechnology?
Yeah, that's a really important point. We need to have these open and transparent discussions about the potential benefits and the potential risks. We need to find that balance between pushing forward with innovation, but also being responsible and making sure that these technologies are used ethically and sustainably for the benefit of people and the planet.
I completely agree with that. So it seems like biotechnology really does have this power to reshape how we think about food and how we produce it and how we consume it. Approaching it thoughtfully and considering all of those implications is essential. But it's not just protein, right? These microbes, they can also produce other things like vitamins.
Yeah, that's right. For instance, vitamin C. We often think of citrus fruits, but the first commercial production of vitamin C actually involved fermentation using bacteria. And
Mhm.
so this was done with Bacillus megaterium. And so they were able to produce vitamin C through this bacterial fermentation process.
Wow, that's pretty cool. What about some of the other vitamins, like vitamin B2?
Oh, yeah. So if you look at vitamin B2, using E. coli in a controlled environment, you can actually boost the production yield of vitamin B2 by like 300 times.
300 times. That's incredible. And what about B12? This is one that a lot of people who maybe don't eat meat struggle with.
Yeah, so that's where propionibacteria come into play.
Hmm.
They actually produce vitamin B12. So it's a really valuable source for this essential vitamin for anybody who's, choosing a plant-based diet.
Okay, so we've talked about protein, we've talked about vitamins, but what about when we go to the grocery store? What about something like yogurt or sour cream? These are all in the dairy aisle. Are those teeming with bacteria too?
Oh yeah, for sure. The world of fermented milk products is incredibly diverse, and so each of these products relies on specific bacteria to achieve its unique flavor and texture. So for example, buttermilk. That kind of tanky flavor comes from Streptococcus species. And the subtle differences between brands often just come down to the specific strains of bacteria that they're using.
So just changing the bacteria just a little bit can really impact the flavor of the buttermilk. That's really interesting. What about Bulgarian milk?
Yeah, Bulgarian milk has this kind of intense acidity that comes from Lactobacillus bulgaricus. And this is one of the key players in yogurt production as well.
Oh, interesting. So yogurt actually gets its flavor and texture from a couple different types of bacteria.
Yeah, that's right. So in addition to that Lactobacillus bulgaricus, there's also Streptococcus thermophilus that's helping make that yogurt what it is.
Huh, I never knew that. What about acidophilus milk? What's going on in that?
Yeah, so acidophilus milk relies solely on Lactobacillus acidophilus. And so in order to ensure that that's the dominant bacteria, the milk is actually sterilized before they add in that culture.
So they kill all the bacteria and then they add in the specific one that they want. That's interesting. What about something like sour cream?
Yeah, sour cream gets its thickness and its tang from lactic acid bacteria.
So it's amazing all these things that lactic acid bacteria are responsible for in the dairy aisle.
Yeah.
But stepping away from the dairy aisle for a second, what about meat? We don't always think of meat as being fermented, but I know there are some fermented meats.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like salami summer sausage, Lebanon bologna. All of those rely on fermentation, and they get those tangy, savory flavors from that fermentation process. Lactobacillus plantarum and Pediococcus cerevisiae are working together to help create those tangy flavors, but they also help to preserve the meat.
It's interesting because those are definitely like my favorite kinds of meat. And they do all have like a very unique flavor. And now I know that's because of bacteria. What about fungi? Do fungi play a role in meat at all?
They do, actually.
Sure.
So if you think about country hams,
Yeah.
they often have fungi growing on their surface.
Hmm.
And these are fungi like penicillium and aspergillus, and they actually contribute to the characteristic flavor and aroma of those country hams.
Huh. I guess so, because I always think of country ham as being like kind of moldy, but I guess that mold is actually helping to create the flavor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we've been talking about different types of fermentation, like homolactic and heterolactic fermentation. What's the difference between those?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm curious about that too.
So homolactic fermentation is like the direct path to lactic acid. It creates that classic tanginess. But heterolactic fermentation, that's a little bit more complex. There's a lot more going on. So you get that lactic acid, but then you also have ethanol and carbon dioxide that are produced. So you get a greater diversity of flavors and textures from that.
So homolactic fermentation is like a solo act, and heterolactic fermentation is more like a band.
Yeah, I like that analogy. Well, this has been really cool, but I think now it's time to move on to something even more fun.
Yeah.
Let's talk about alcoholic beverages.
Okay.
Beer, wine, spirits.
All right, so let's talk about Saccharomyces yeast. This is kind of the star player when it comes to making all of these delicious beverages. So for beer, it all starts with malted barley. What is malted barley?
Yeah, I've always wondered about that too.
So that's the process of partially germinating the barley grains. And what that does is it releases enzymes that are able to break down starch into sugar. So this provides the fuel for our fermentation.
So it's not just about creating sugar for the yeast, it also really impacts the flavor of the final beer. Yeah, for sure. So the malting process really influences the final character of the beer. Yeah. So after malting, those grains are dried, they're crushed, and then they're mixed with hot water to create something called wort. And then we add hops, which adds bitterness and aroma. We boil that whole mixture to stop that enzymatic activity, and that gets it ready for the yeast to do their thing.
Okay, so the yeast goes into the wort, and then what happens?
So then that Saccharomyces yeast gets to work converting those sugars in the wort into ethanol, which is what gives beer that alcoholic kick. And they also produce carbon dioxide, which creates those delightful bubbles. But it doesn't stop there. Those yeast also produce byproducts like amyl alcohols and various acids, which add a lot of complexity to the flavor profile.
Oh, wow. So it really is like a symphony of flavors that these yeasts are responsible for.
It
So
is.
the yeast is done. What happens next?
So after fermentation is complete, then the beer is filtered to remove any solids,
Yeah.
and then it's pasteurized at about 60 degrees Celsius to make sure that it's stable and safe. And then finally it's bottled, ready to be enjoyed. And this typically has an alcohol content around 6%.
Wow, that's really interesting. Okay, now let's switch gears a little bit. Let's talk about wine. So with beer, we've got the barley, but with wine, we're starting with grapes. What's the role of microbes in turning grape juice into wine?
Yeah, so winemaking is all about capturing the essence of the grape, and fermentation is the heart of that process.
Yeah.
So we start with juice extracted from the grapes, and we treat it with sulfur dioxide. And what this does is it gets rid of any wild yeast, and it ensures that we have a controlled fermentation.
Oh, so you're kind of setting the stage for a specific yeast to go in and do its thing?
Exactly, yeah. And so once that juice is prepped, then we introduce specific strains of Saccharomyces yeast. And if we want to make a sweeter wine, we can add sugar as well. And the yeast all get to work converting that sugar into ethanol and all those flavorful byproducts that we talked about.
Mm-hmm.
And the magic of winemaking really lies in those subtle variations. So the grape variety, the yeast strain, the temperature that we use for fermentation, all of those things affect the final character of the wine.
It's really incredible how many different factors are impacting the final flavor of the wine. And then after fermentation, some wines are aged, right?
Yeah, that's right. So after fermentation, sometimes wines are aged for months or even years. And this allows for a variety of chemical reactions to occur to further refine that flavor and aroma. And this is where all those subtle nuances and complexities that we associate with like a fine wine really begin to emerge.
So it's like the yeast start the process and then time also plays a role in the final flavor. Okay, so we've talked about beer, we've talked about wine. What about spirits? How do they differ from beer and wine?
So spirits, they have a similar starting point. So you have fermentation of a sugary liquid, but what's different is distillation. So after fermentation, the liquid is heated,
Mm.
and so the alcohol and other volatile flavor compounds those all vaporize, and that vapor is collected and condensed, and that results in a more concentrated alcoholic beverage.
So that's why spirits are so much stronger than beer or wine.
Yeah, exactly. Because of that distillation process, the alcohol content in spirits can range anywhere from 40 to 50%, which is way higher than your typical beer or wine. So whether you're talking about a light beer or a robust whiskey, it all starts with fermentation and those microscopic friends that we've been talking about, the yeast. Okay, now there's one more thing that I think we have to talk about before we wrap up this section. And this is a really important staple food,
Okay, what is it?
bread.
Oh, bread. Okay, so I know yeast is involved in making bread, but I don't really know the details.
Okay, well, yeast is really a multitasker when it comes to bread making.
Yeah.
It contributes to leavening, it contributes to flavor development, and it contributes to dough conditioning. So let's start with leavening. That's what gives bread that light and airy texture that we all love so much.
Yeah, I think that's what makes a difference between a really good loaf of bread and one that's kind of dense and hard to eat.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it all comes down to the release of carbon dioxide during fermentation. So without leavening, bread would be flat and dense. So the yeast and the kneading process, which develops gluten and incorporates air, work together to create those air pockets that make bread so enjoyable to eat.
So it's like a team effort between the baker and the yeast that are invisible.
It is.
Okay, so the yeast help the bread rise, but do they impact the flavor at all?
Oh, yeah, for sure. So as that yeast is fermenting, it produces carbon dioxide, but it also produces a variety of volatile acids and alcohols.
Right.
And these all contribute to that characteristic yeasty, slightly sweet aroma and taste that we associate with bread.
Wow, so those tiny little yeast are really packing in a lot of flavor. I've also heard that different types of yeast and bacteria can lead to different bread flavors.
That's right, yeah. So Saccharomyces cerevisiae, that's like the workhorse of bread making. It's the most commonly used baker's yeast. It loves those sugars that are found in dough. And it primarily respires aerobically, and it produces carbon dioxide and water, which is perfect for leavening.
Yeah.
But you also have wild yeast that can be found naturally on grains and fruits. And these can add some really unique flavors to bread. And then there's lactic acid bacteria, which are responsible for the tangy flavor in sourdough bread.
Sourdough, so good. So that tanginess comes from bacteria, not from yeast.
Yeah, that's right. So you have Lactobacillus sanfrancesensis that gives sourdough its signature tang,
Mhm.
and the earthy flavor of rye bread that's not just coming from the grain itself. It's also coming from a whole community of lactic acid bacteria like Lactobacillus plantarum and Lactobacillus brevis that are all working together to create those unique flavors.
It's really incredible how these different types of bacteria and yeast can impact the flavor of bread so much. So we've gone from like the subtle variations in buttermilk to the really strong tang of sourdough, and it seems like bacteria are just as important as yeast when it comes to impacting these flavors.
They are.
Well, this has been really cool. I've learned a lot.